August 1944. The cargo hold reeked of salt and fear. 84 German women crossed the Atlantic, their voices dropping to whispers in the darkness, warning one another about what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. American scalp prisoners, they'll starve like animals, the warnings went. Greta clutched a forbidden photograph of her 8-year-old daughter against her ribs, bracing herself for the brutality they'd all been promised. Then Camp Comstock appeared. Clean barracks, real beds, no screaming guards. During intake, the photograph slipped from Greta's sock and she froze, waiting for punishment. But the American woman in the Red Cross uniform just studied it, then handed it back gently. "She's beautiful, you'll see her again." Weeks later, a shipment arrived: lipsticks, powder compacts, hand cream. The camp commander announced that the Geneva Convention said prisoners retain dignity. "You can have these if you want them." These weren't the barbarians they'd been warned about. They were something far more dangerous. Decent. The cargo hold stank of salt water and engine grease, the sour tang of fear sweat rising from 84 bodies pressed together in the dark. Greta Mueller sat with her back against the cold metal wall, knees drawn up, the forbidden photograph tucked beneath her ribs where no one could see it. Around her, whispers moved like rats through the shadows, warnings traded in hushed German, each one more terrible than the last. "American prisoners get scalped. I heard it from a woman in Paris. They're savages who'll parade us through their streets. Don't let them know you speak English. They'll think you're a spy and shoot you on sight." Greta pressed her palm flat against her sternum, feeling the sharp corner of the photograph through the thin fabric of her uniform. Anneliese. 8 years old, dark braids, that gap-toothed smile she'd inherited from her father. The last time Greta had held her daughter was 18 months ago, before the forced auxiliary transport to France, before the Allied advance, before capture, before everything that had seemed certain revealed itself as smoke. The ship groaned, metal grinding against metal as it cut through the Atlantic. Greta had never been on a vessel this size, had never imagined she'd cross an ocean as cargo, as enemy, as something less than human. The propaganda posters had shown American soldiers with exaggerated features, cruel mouths, grasping hands, predatory eyes, barbarians who knew nothing of civilization, who would treat German prisoners the way they treated everything else, with violence and contempt. Beside her, a younger woman named Liesel, sharp-featured and rigid with conviction, leaned close. "Don't show weakness when we arrive. They feed on weakness like dogs." Greta nodded, but said nothing. She'd learned in 3 years of war that the ones who talked most about strength were often the most terrified underneath. The ship's horn sounded low and mournful. Women stirred, murmured, clutched each other's hands. After 2 weeks at sea, they were arriving. Greta's heart hammered against the photograph. The August heat hit like a fist when they finally emerged onto the deck. Texas. The word meant nothing to Greta except distance, an impossible gulf between herself and everything she'd known. Armed guards lined the dock, but their rifles hung loose at their sides. No snarling, no shouting, just young men in uniforms watching with expressions Greta couldn't quite read. Curiosity, boredom, not hatred. That was what unnerved her most. Comstock sprawled behind chain-link fencing, rows of wooden barracks painted a pale yellow that seemed obscene in its cheerfulness. Real buildings, not muddy trenches or bombed-out ruins. Greta's throat tightened. This had to be temporary, a holding area before the real punishment began. They were marched through the gates in a silent column. No one spat at them, no one jeered. The Americans simply directed them forward with minimal words, minimal contact. Inside a processing building, women were separated into small groups. Greta found herself standing before a folding table where an American woman in a Red Cross uniform sat with a clipboard and a tired expression. The woman looked up. Her face was unremarkable, thin, drawn, dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze was direct. She said something in English that Greta didn't catch, then switched to German. Careful German, slightly accented, but clear. Name? Muller. Greta Muller. Her voice came out rougher than she'd intended. The Red Cross woman wrote it down. Date of birth? Greta answered automatically, her mind elsewhere, focused on keeping the photograph hidden. But when she shifted her weight, The picture slipped just a fraction and tumbled from inside her sock onto the concrete floor. Time slowed. Greta stared at Annaliese's face, looking up from the ground, vulnerable and exposed. Her breath stopped. This was it. They'd confiscate it. Question her about it. Use it against her somehow. The American woman, her name tag reading Ruth, bent down and picked up the photograph. She held it carefully, studying the image of the little girl with dark braids. For a long moment she said nothing, and Greta felt her entire body go rigid with dread. Then Ruth looked up, met Greta's eyes, and spoke in that careful, accented German. "She's beautiful." She held the photograph out, offering it back. "You'll see her again." Greta's hand trembled as she took it. The photograph felt heavier now, impossible. She searched Ruth's face for mockery, for cruelty disguised as kindness, but found only a bone-deep sadness that seemed to mirror her own. "Thank you," Greta whispered, and the words felt like treason against everything she'd been taught to believe. That night, lying on a real mattress in a barracks that had screens on the windows and a roof that didn't leak, Greta tucked the photograph under her pillow and stared at the wooden ceiling. Around her, women whispered their confusion and suspicion. Liesel's voice cut through the darkness. "They're softening us, making us weak. Don't trust it." But Greta couldn't stop thinking about Ruth's hands. Gentle, deliberate, returning what any guard could have confiscated. If that small mercy was real, what else might be? And if everything they'd been told about Americans was a lie, what other lies had she swallowed whole? The question terrified her more than any threat of violence ever could. The laundry detail became Greta's rhythm, her anchor in a world that refused to make sense. 6 days a week, she stood at the industrial sinks with 5 other women, scrubbing rows of green uniforms and white cotton sheets until her hands turned raw. The work was mindless, repetitive, exactly what she needed, while her thoughts circled endlessly around the same impossible question. Why weren't they being punished? The food arrived 3 times daily, plain but adequate. Oatmeal in the mornings, sandwiches at noon, some kind of meat and potatoes in the evenings. No one went hungry, no one was beaten. The guards maintained their distance, professional and largely indifferent. It was the indifference that unsettled Greta most. She'd been prepared for hatred, for rage, for the kind of treatment she knew German camps inflicted on their prisoners. Instead, she got bureaucratic efficiency and an absence of cruelty that felt more disorienting than any violence. Ruth appeared at the laundry station most afternoons, clipboard in hand, checking on supplies or asking if anyone needed medical attention. She never lingered, never pushed conversation, but Greta found herself watching the Red Cross woman with increasing curiosity. The other American staff rotated through, different faces, different voices, but Ruth was constant. There was something in the careful way she spoke German, the slight hesitation before certain words, that nagged at Greta's teacher-trained ear. One afternoon in late September, while hanging sheets on the outdoor line, Greta overheard Ruth speaking with another Red Cross worker near the fence. The conversation was in English, too fast for Greta to follow completely, but certain words emerged clear enough. Germany, Frankfurt, parents. The grief in Ruth's voice transcended language. That night, lying in her bunk, Greta pieced it together. Ruth's German wasn't learned from textbooks. It was native, polished smooth by childhood use, then overlaid with American English. She was one of us, Greta thought, and the realization landed with uncomfortable weight. One of us and one of them. Both. Neither. Standing in some impossible middle ground that Greta couldn't quite fathom. October arrived with cooler temperatures and news that rippled through the camp like electricity. A shipment from the Red Cross, donated items from American church groups. The camp commander would be making an announcement after evening meal. Greta sat on a bench outside the mess hall with 24 other women, watching the sun sink low over the Texas landscape. The light here was different than in Germany. Bigger somehow, more exposed. She missed the forests, the close grey skies of home, missed the narrow alleys with an ache that had become part of her breathing. The commander was a middle-aged man with a slight paunch and tired eyes, who spoke through a translator. His words came slow and deliberate. The Geneva Convention mandates that prisoners of war retain personal dignity. We have received donated items, personal care supplies, lipstick, powder compacts, hand cream. You may accept these items if you choose. No one will be forced. Silence dropped like a stone. Greta felt the shock move through the assembled women in a visible wave. Makeup, feminine things, items that belonged to a world before war, before capture, before they had been reduced to numbers and identical uniforms. Liesel rose from her seat, spine rigid, her voice rang out in German, translated haltingly by the interpreter. This is corruption. You want us to forget who we are, to become soft, complicit. The commander listened to the translation, then responded with something that might have been weariness, or might have been respect. You are prisoners, not animals. The choices are yours. The supplies were distributed in the mess hall, small cardboard boxes set on tables, women filing past to take what they wanted or nothing at all. Greta watched the line, watched women hesitate, reach out, pull back. Some took nothing, faces set hard against temptation. Others grabbed items quickly, furtively, as if the boxes might vanish. When Greta reached the table, Ruth stood there, organizing the supplies with methodical care. Their eyes met. Ruth gestured to the boxes, expression neutral, offering without pushing. Greta's hand hovered over a compact, a small pot of cream, then settled on a single tube of lipstick. Red. Not bright red, something deeper, more subdued. The kind of red a schoolteacher might wear on an ordinary day in an ordinary world. Good choice, Ruth said quietly in German. Greta closed her fingers around the tube. It weighed almost nothing. Why? The question came out before she could stop it. Why do you do this? Give us these things. Ruth's expression shifted. Something painful moved beneath the surface. Because when we forget people are human, we create camps. She said it simply, as if it were obvious. On both sides, Greta returned to the barracks with the lipstick burning a hole in her pocket. Around her, women argued in harsh whispers. Half had taken nothing, viewing the gesture as manipulation or weakness. Half clutched their small treasures like lifelines. The barracks felt fractured, split along invisible fault lines. That night, alone in the latrine, Greta unscrewed the lipstick with shaking hands. The mirror above the sink was cracked, distorting her reflection into fragments. She raised the tube to her lips and paused. 3 years since she had worn lipstick, attended a school assembly, walked an alley to kindergarten like a normal mother in a normal world. She applied the color slowly, carefully, looked at her reflection. The face looking back wasn't prisoner number 724, wasn't faceless enemy. Just a woman. 32 years old, still breathing, still here. For the first time since capture, Greta almost smiled. December brought cold that seeped through the barracks walls and news that changed everything. The camp commander announced a new policy. Prisoners could write letters home. Censored, of course, every word would be reviewed, potentially rejected, but delivered. Actually delivered under Geneva Convention protocols through neutral Switzerland and the International Red Cross. Greta sat on her bunk that evening with a piece of paper and a stubby pencil, staring at the blank page until her eyes burned. Around her, other women hunched over their own letters, some writing furiously, others frozen like she was. What could she possibly say? How did you compress 18 months of separation, of war, of capture and confusion into a single censored page? She thought of Annaliese's face in the photograph. Tried to imagine her at 9 now, instead of 8. Taller, probably. Perhaps the gap in her teeth had closed. Maybe she'd forgotten her mother's voice. The pencil trembled in Greta's hand. She wrote the address first, her mother's house in Bavaria, the only place Annaliese would be. Then she began, each word feeling inadequate and enormous at once. Dearest Annaliese, the food here is plain but enough. My bed has a real pillow. They let me write to you. That is something. I think of you every morning when I wake and every night before I sleep. I hope you are being good for Oma. I hope you remember I love you. Always, Mutti. She didn't mention the lipstick, didn't mention Ruth's kindness, or the donated supplies, or the creeping, terrifying realization that everything she'd been taught about Americans might be wrong. Those truths were too strange, too unbelievable. They'd only worry her mother, confuse Annalisa. Better to keep it simple, safe. Other women weren't so cautious. Greta overheard fragments of letters being read aloud for approval, some honest, some carefully coded. One woman wrote about the expected treatment and conditions as warned, maintaining the propaganda even from inside the contradiction. Another described the mess hall food in detail, the clean water, the medical care, small truths that felt like treason to speak aloud. 3 days after Greta mailed her letter, Liesel intercepted another prisoner near the latrine. The woman, Margaret, quiet and mouse-like, had written about kindness, about respect from the guards, about feeling safer here than she had in the last year of the war. Liesel had somehow obtained a copy, and now she stood in the center of the barracks, waving it like evidence of betrayal. Listen to this. Liesel's voice cut through the evening quiet. They treat us with dignity. The Red Cross woman speaks beautiful German and remembers our names. She spat the words, "This is how it starts. This is how they corrupt us, make us forget what we're fighting for." Margaret's face went white. "We're not fighting anymore. We lost. We're prisoners. We're still German." Liesel advanced, and Greta saw something wild in her eyes, the same desperation that had been building for weeks. That lipstick, those letters, all of it. It's designed to make us weak, to make us betray our people. She lunged for Greta's footlocker, yanked it open before anyone could stop her. The lipstick tube rolled onto the floor. Liesel snatched it up, raised her fist to smash it. Greta moved without thinking, caught Liesel's wrist mid-swing. No. For a moment they stood locked together, Liesel shaking with fury, Greta holding firm. Around them, other women had risen from their bunks. Some sided with Liesel. Greta could see it in their faces. Others moved closer to Margaret, to Greta, forming a silent barrier. "It's just lipstick," Greta said quietly. "It doesn't make us anything except human." "Human?" Liesel's laugh was jagged. "They gave us makeup while our country burns, while our men die, and you think that makes them good?" Greta's voice carried through the barracks with quiet certainty. "What makes us human? I think it means we remain ourselves, not reduced to numbers, not stripped down to faceless enemies. Still ourselves, with everything that means." An older woman named Frau Weber, her grey hair pinned back with the precision of someone holding on to routine, moved forward deliberately. She reached out and gently took the lipstick from Liesel's trembling fingers, then turned it back to Greta. Her eyes swept across the room, commanding attention without raising her voice. "We have every right to hate what's been done to us. We can hate this war with every fiber of our being, but we don't have to hate ourselves for surviving it." The words hung in the stale air. Something shifted, broke open. Liesel stumbled backward to her bunk, her face collapsing inward as sobs took her. Other women followed, their hands reaching out in silent support. Some drifted back to their letters, those fragile lifelines to people across an ocean that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. That particular night, Greta found sleep impossible. She lay in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of Liesel's grief from the far corner, to voices that whispered but never quite stopped. The lipstick rested in her locker, and suddenly she understood its true weight. It wasn't merely color for her lips. It was proof that they remained women, not abstractions. Proof that they were mothers, daughters, teachers, clerks. People who deserved to exist beyond whatever roles had been forced upon them. 3 months crawled past. Early March arrived cold and tentative. Ruth found Greta in the laundry room, moving through the repetitive motions that now defined her days, and pressed an envelope into her hands. The postage was international. Swiss stamps adorned the corners. Greta's hand shook so violently she nearly dropped it. Inside lay a single page in her mother's deliberate, careful handwriting. Folded carefully within was a drawing. Crayon on old newspaper. A woman with dark hair, smiling, standing before a small house. Beneath it, in letters that wavered with childish uncertainty, the words were written, "Mumi, Van Annalisa." Greta pressed the drawing against her chest and wept, her whole body heaving with the force of it. Ruth remained beside her, silent and motionless, offering only presence. She didn't speak. She didn't reach out to touch. She simply stood witness. When Greta finally lifted her eyes, she saw tears streaming down Ruth's face as well. A different kind of grief. A different loss. But loss nonetheless. "She remembers you," Ruth said, her voice barely audible. Greta nodded, unable to force words through her throat. For the first time since her capture, something stirred within her that wasn't mere survival. It was fragile and terrifying, but it was undeniably real. It was hope. April arrived with wildflowers pushing through the earth along the camp fence, their colors impossibly bright. Then came an announcement that drained the life from every face in the compound. Mandatory assembly, everyone to the mess hall immediately. A newsreel would be shown, footage from Europe. The camp commander's face was carved from stone as he explained what the film contained. Footage discovered by Allied forces when they liberated the camps. Greta filed in with the others, her stomach already twisting with something she couldn't name. She'd heard whispers, rumors that made their way through even the most carefully censored news. Labor camps, concentration camps, places where those deemed enemies of the Reich had been sent. But official propaganda had always brushed aside such talk as exaggeration, as Allied lies meant to justify their own actions. The lights died. The projector hummed to life. Iron gates appeared on the screen first. Gates with words worked directly into the metal. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. Greta had seen that phrase 100 times on posters and in speeches about the dignity of labor, about the purification of the state. Then the camera moved inward. Bodies, countless bodies, skeletal forms, naked and stacked like discarded firewood. Living people who resembled nothing so much as corpses, their eyes enormous in skulls, covered with skin stretched thin as paper. Children with swollen bellies and cheeks hollowed to nothing. Ovens, brick structures standing in orderly rows. Train cars crammed with the dead. Bulldozers pushing mass graves. Bergen-Belsen. Dachau, Buchenwald. The narrator's voice remained clinical, emotionless. Numbers were listed, thousands, tens of thousands. More. The camera showed Allied soldiers weeping as they struggled to help survivors too weak to even stand. It showed German civilians from nearby towns being forced through the camps, being made to witness what had been committed in their names. Greta felt the room tilt sickeningly around her. Beside her, someone gagged. Someone else released a keening sob. Many sat completely motionless, their faces slack with shock and disbelief. Allied propaganda, a voice whispered nearby. Staged. It has to be staged. But Greta couldn't tear her eyes from the screen. Couldn't unsee the children's faces, hollow and haunted. Couldn't unsee the mountains of shoes. The victims of medical experiments. And she knew with the same bone-deep certainty she'd felt when Ruth returned her photograph that this was real. This had actually happened. Her country had done this. Her nation had built factories dedicated to death. The lipstick in her pocket felt obscene, an offense. How could she accept kindness, dignity, small mercies when her country had constructed industrialized death? When she'd believed the lies so completely that she'd taught them to her students? Had sent her own daughter to Hitler youth meetings because that's what responsible German mothers were supposed to do. The lights blazed back on. No one moved a muscle. The camp commander's voice was heavy, almost broken. This is what we fought against. This is why we believed you should know the truth. Greta stumbled outside into the harsh Texas afternoon. The sunlight felt wrong, too cheerful, too relentlessly ordinary for a world that had just shattered. Around her, women scattered in different directions. Some ran for the barracks, others simply collapsed onto benches wherever they stood. Weeping came from every corner of the compound. Liesel stood pressed against the fence, her hands gripping the chain link so hard her knuckles had turned white. Her entire body convulsed with sobs. Not angry sobs, broken ones, the kind that emerged when your entire understanding of the world crumbled into fragments too small to ever piece back together. Greta found herself standing at the edge of the compound, staring at absolutely nothing. The wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze. In the distance, a mockingbird sang its song, indifferent to human suffering. The world continued turning as if nothing fundamental had changed. But everything had transformed. Everything. Ruth appeared silently at Greta's side. They stood together for long minutes, neither speaking, the silence between them a language of its own. Finally, Ruth's voice emerged, quiet and fractured. "My grandmother, my cousins, Bergen-Belsen." She stopped, swallowed hard. "My parents escaped in '38. They brought me here when I was 13. I found out only last week that the others didn't make it." Greta turned to look at her directly. Ruth's face was wet with tears, but beneath the grief her expression held a strange, terrible steadiness. "You think I don't understand what you carry," Ruth continued, her voice steady despite the tears. "I carry it too. Different sides. Same grief." "How?" Greta's voice cracked completely. "How do you—" She couldn't finish the question. "How do you show us mercy? How do you treat us like human beings? How do you bear it?" Ruth met her eyes directly. "The lipstick isn't about forgetting, it's about remembering you're human. Because when we forget that, when anyone forgets that, we get camps on both sides." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward and outward. Greta thought about the propaganda machine, the systematic dehumanization, the slow, methodical process of transforming people into things, into problems requiring solutions, threats requiring elimination. And she thought about Ruth, choosing every single day to see the women in this camp as people, as mothers and daughters, as human beings worthy of dignity. "I don't deserve it," Greta whispered. "Any of us." "Deserving stopped being relevant long ago," Ruth replied, her voice firm and unyielding. "Dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you choose. You choose it for yourself, and you choose it for others. That's the only path forward that actually works." That night, the barracks fell into silence broken only by quiet weeping. No one reached for makeup, no one wrote letters. The drawings from children back home, the photographs of families, the small objects that had meant so much, all of it felt poisoned now, impossible to reconcile with what they'd witnessed on that screen. Greta lay awake holding the lipstick tube, feeling its weight against her palm. She wanted to throw it away, wanted to reject every kindness she'd received, wanted to punish herself with the same brutality her country had inflicted on millions. But Ruth's words kept circling through her mind. "When we forget people are human, we get camps on both sides." Perhaps mercy wasn't about whether someone deserved it. Perhaps it was about choosing to break the cycle instead of perpetuating it. Choosing to see humanity even when it would be infinitely easier to forget. The choice felt impossible and necessary and terrifying all at once. The weeks following the newsreel passed in a grey fog. Greta moved through her days mechanically, laundry, meals, sleep, but she felt disconnected from all of it, as though she were watching herself from very far away. The lipstick stayed buried at the bottom of her footlocker. Letters from Anneliese went unanswered. What could she possibly say? How could she explain to her daughter that everything they'd believed was built on graves? The camp had transformed around her. Women who'd begun to smile again, to laugh, to reclaim small pieces of themselves, retreated back into silence. The barracks felt like a tomb. Even the spring weather, warm and bright and full of new growth, seemed like cruel mockery. Late one April evening, Greta sat alone on the barrack steps, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. She didn't hear Ruth approaching until the other woman settled beside her, leaving respectful distance but offering her presence. They sat in silence for several minutes. Then Ruth began to speak, her voice soft and careful. "My grandparents owned a bookshop in Frankfurt. My father used to tell me stories about it, how they'd stay open late on Friday nights, how the whole neighborhood would gather to argue about literature over tea." She paused, her eyes distant. "My mother's family were musicians. Her brother played violin in the Berlin Philharmonic." Greta listened, afraid to speak and break the moment. "They didn't leave when my parents did. They thought it would blow over. Thought being German would protect them. Thought their neighbors would stand with them." Ruth's hands were clenched tightly in her lap. "Bergen-Belsen. All of them. The Red Cross confirmed it 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry." The words felt pathetically inadequate, but Greta offered them anyway. "You think I don't understand what you carry?" Ruth turned to look at her fully. "I carry it too. Different sides, same grief, same questions about how people we loved, countries we loved, became capable of such things. Greta's throat closed completely. How do you, she stopped, started again. How do you not hate us? Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Some days I do. Some days I look at all of you and I see their faces. My grandmother, my cousin Sarah, who was only 6 years old. Her voice cracked. But then I remember that hate is what created the camps in the first place. On both sides. And if I let it consume me, if I stop seeing you as human, then I become part of the same cycle. She reached over and gently took Greta's hand. The lipstick isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about remembering you're human. Because when we forget that, when anyone forgets that, we get camps, we get ovens, we get children in mass graves. Greta felt something break open in her chest. But after what we did, what my country did, how can I accept mercy? How can any of us? Because mercy isn't about deserving, Ruth said firmly. It's about choosing who we're going to be tomorrow. The camps exist because people stopped seeing each other as human. The only way forward is to refuse to do the same thing. The words settled into Greta like seeds into soil. Not comfortable, not easy, but true. The next morning, Greta found Liesel alone, behind the laundry building, sitting with her back pressed against the wall, staring at nothing. The young woman looked hollowed out, decades older than her actual 22 years. Greta had heard through whispered conversations that Liesel had stopped eating, stopped speaking, spent her nights awake and staring at nothing. Greta sat down beside her without asking permission. She didn't speak. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply remained. After nearly an hour of complete silence, Liesel's voice emerged, barely audible. My whole family, Dresden. The firebombing. I thought if I believed hard enough, if I stayed loyal enough, their deaths would mean something. Would have been for something. I know, Greta said quietly. But it was all lies, Liesel continued, her face crumpling. They died for lies. I hated for lies. She couldn't continue. Greta reached into her pocket and pulled out the lipstick tube. She held it out silently. This isn't about being German or American. It's not about forgetting or forgiving what happened. It's about deciding who we are tomorrow. Liesel stared at the tube as if it was something utterly foreign, something she didn't have a framework to understand. How can you use that, after what we saw? Because Ruth was right, Greta said. When we stop being human, when we let ourselves become only our worst moments, that's when we create more camps, more ovens, more children in graves. Greta pressed the lipstick into Liesel's shaking hands. This is me choosing to still be a person. To still be Annaliese's mother. To still be someone who can teach her something true. Liesel's fingers closed around the tube. She didn't use it, but she didn't throw it away either. She simply held it like an anchor. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the camp. Not healing. It was far too soon for that. The wounds cut far too deep. But women began to emerge from the fog. They organized a small memorial service, acknowledging their own losses and the camp's victims in the same breath. No easy forgiveness, no pretending the horror could be erased, just shared grief and the tentative recognition that they could carry both sorrow for what was done and determination never to perpetuate it. On May 8th, news rippled through the camp. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was finished. Greta sat at a table in the mess hall and pulled out paper and pencil. This time, the words came more easily. She wrote to Annaliese, I want you to know the truth about everything. About the propaganda we believed, about the camps our country built, about the lipstick the Americans let me keep and the mercy I didn't deserve but received anyway. I want you to grow up knowing that mercy is real even when cruelty exists too. That small kindness matters, especially when everything else is shattered. That's what I learned here. That's what I'm bringing home to you.